that you use to sign up, one of which is our planning for the family home chart, kind of things that people tend to do as a common planning mechanism. I'll talk about some of these today too, and then some of the risks of the common planning tactics, and then what you should be looking at doing instead potentially. Obviously, everybody's situation is going to be a little different, so what may apply for one person might not for another, but it's generally helpful information. And then you'll also receive a place where you can reach out to us to set aside time to talk. If we, anything we talk about today raises concerns about maybe a loved one needing care sometime soon, or who's in care currently, or yourself that you're trying to plan for, it'll give you a place to reach out to us to set aside time for an initial consultation. Those are complimentary consultations. They don't cost you anything to talk to us. And then we do schedule them for about 2 hours, so they can, it gives us enough time to sort of sit down and really get to know the situation and hopefully give you a pretty solid recommendation at the end of that 2 hours. So we do ask for some information on before you come in and talk to us, just so that we can really have a really good picture of what we're working with in terms of your family and the types of assets that somebody might have. But that really does allow us to make a better recommendation. But again, those initial consultations are complimentary, so it does not cost you anything to come in and talk to us initially. So when we're talking about stretching your money as long as possible on long-term care planning, paying for care, making sure that the money you have is going to last as long as you can make it last. Because one of the most common concerns as people start to get older is, I've heard care is really expensive, and as much as I don't maybe want to go into a facility, I have very few clients who say, I can't wait to move into the nursing home or the assisted living facility, just because you're leaving your home, but with the anticipation that it's a potential or I guess a possibility for that person needing care at some point in the future. The concern over care is a valid one. The concern over cost of care, rather, is a valid one. And so how do you pay for care, and what is the cost of that care? To give you an idea on cost of care, it ranges a lot depending on the type of care that somebody might need, whether that's care at home, care in assisted living, or care in a full skilled nursing facility. The range is going to be different for that. And sometimes there's a pretty big range even within those different levels of care because of how, varied that care can be. So most people I talk to say, I'll just have someone come into the home and provide care at home. I'll never go to a facility. And that can sound great in terms of, obviously you get to stay in home. It can be the cheapest option, but it can also be the most expensive option too. So care at home, when you have someone come in, you generally pay an hourly rate for that, nurse who's maybe coming in to provide care, that caregiver coming in, and it's generally around $30 an hour is kind of the standard I've seen. It might be higher or lower depending on your needs or the agency you're working through, but generally about $30 an hour. So if you need a couple hours of care every week, that's not too bad, right? I mean, if I only needed 10 hours of care, that's $300 a week. That's not terrible, $1,200 a month. But it can also be the most expensive if you need the type of care that you would need in an assisted living facility or in a skilled nursing facility. If you need skilled nursing level care, just in terms of the type of care, I don't just mean in the facility, but the level of care you would need, that's more expensive on average than actually going to a full skilled nursing facility. I mean, if you run the math on that, you tend to be around 13, 14, 15 grand a month if you need round the clock care at home, and you have someone coming into the home to do that care. On top of it, just maybe not being the best location, or you not having access to the facilities you need or the types of equipment you would need in your home. It's just not the right fit for everybody. So at-home care can be a great option. And it's, obviously people's first choice, but it's not always the best option either. The Bill Gates of the world, the Warren Buffett's of the world, the people who could build a hospital room basically in their houses, yeah, that might be what they choose to do. It's probably what they're going to choose to do. But most of us can't do that, right? Especially with fixed income and retirement. So assisted living is sort of the next step that somebody might look at if at-home care is maybe not the best option or it's starting to get too expensive. Assisted living care can really range in cost depending on what type of assisted living care you need. I've seen for some people who maybe need some assistance who, not necessarily Alzheimer's or dementia care required, no memory care issues. They may be on the lower end, somewhere between $4,500 a month, 4,500, or somewhere in the $5,000 or $6,000 range potentially per month. Now, that's still obviously very expensive, but not as expensive as when you get into memory care type assisted living care, where that could be anywhere between $7,000 or $8,000 a month, or maybe more. It just depends on the facility, but generally speaking, you're in that $7,000 to $8,000 range. So you can see there's a pretty big difference between maybe lower level care in an assisted living facility and higher level care when you're getting closer to maybe needing that skilled nursing. Skilled nursing care can generally range anywhere between $9,000 to, I guess I've seen as high as $11,000 per month. And these numbers go up every year with care costs increasing. I'm sure the overhead costs increasing for the facilities too. So the standard inflation you see on that care cost is about 5% per year. So that's going to continue to go up. It's not likely to go down anytime soon. So how do we pay for that? I mean, obviously, if you're able to cover all of those expenses directly out of income, you're able to privately pay, then you can stretch your assets as long as you need to, because you're just covering out of your own income. You might not be dipping substantially into your life savings or retirement in order to pay for that care. But if that's not an option for you, you can't cover it out of income alone, which a lot of people in retirement can't. Most people in retirement can't. Then how do you pay for this? One of the first things I recommend people look into, if they haven't, is look at long-term care insurance as an option. Get a quote on it. Talk to your advisors to see if they have any recommendations for that. Because long-term care insurance can be a really helpful tool to at least pay for a couple years privately for care without having to dip substantially into your life savings. So long-term care insurance is different than like disability insurance that you might see through like Aflac, where you can't work, so here's the insurance paying for your living expenses. So long-term care insurance is specifically insurance for at-home assisted living or skilled nursing care. And more often than not, it tends to only pay for a certain period of time or a maximum amount. You don't tend to see any more of those policies that pay indefinitely. They don't pay, however much it costs. You see some policies like that from like 20, 30 years ago that, I tell people don't get rid of those. Those are, you're not going to find a replacement for that. But you don't tend to see that too much anymore. Now, ideally, when you're looking into long-term care insurance, you want to look at it sooner rather than later, even sooner than you might be even thinking about going into a facility, because the younger you are, obviously, the less expensive it's going to be, the better health you're in, the less expensive it's going to be. And sometimes long-term care insurance companies will just not cover somebody because of a pre-existing health condition they have. Like if they're diagnosed with Alzheimer's already, they're not going to cover that person most likely. So the ideal time to look at it, generally, early to later 50s, maybe sometime in your 50s is a good range. Some advisors are even recommending earlier than that now, just because of locking in lower costs potentially, depending on the policy. But it's going to really depend on what product you're looking at, and I'm certainly not the expert on the differences between all of those the insurance products that are out there for that. That's where your advisors can really help you. But long-term care insurance, if you have coverage for a couple of years of private payment, what that does is it stretches your money out a lot longer, because you're not dipping into your own money to pay for that care initially, or not as much of your own money initially. You might still not have the full cost covered. So, but even $100 a day through that benefit, while that won't cover most assisted living care fully or skilled nursing care fully, it could provide some help on top of your income and other assets to stretch that money out longer. But for some people, this isn't an option. They may not be able to privately pay out of income alone or indefinitely through their assets alone, and they may not qualify for long-term care insurance. It might be too late, or it might just be too expensive for them. And if that's the case, that's when we're looking at other options to help pay for care. One of the more common planning tools that we look at, or common ways to help pay for care that we look at, is around Medicaid, or sometimes if they're our client is a veteran or they're a surviving spouse of a wartime veteran, that we look at the VA improved pension program to help stretch money for care too. And I'll talk a little bit about both of these. So Medicaid is the most common program that's used to help pay for long-term care. A lot of people think it might be Medicare, but Medicare will cover for rehabilitative stays at a skilled nursing facility for up to about 100 days. They don't cover the full cost for that 100 days. They cover partial costs. And after, whether it's after the 100 days or after that person is staying in that facility indefinitely and they're not going to go home, right? That's when you look at privately paying, because Medicare will stop coverage at that point. So, but if you're not able to privately pay after that point, that's when you're looking at Medicaid to cover care. And in order to qualify for Medicaid for long-term care Medicaid, you're looking at different qualifications, whether you're married or single, in terms of how much you can keep. When you're single, it's pretty straightforward. They don't force you to sell your home, but they will place a lien on the property as Medicaid provides payment. Eventually, it'll eat up the equity. You can keep one vehicle, one car, as long as it doesn't matter the value on that vehicle. It cannot be like a recreational vehicle that you're not using for transport and things like that. So people have tried to use like boats in the past. But then you can keep your life insurance of not more than $1,500 face value before they start to look at any cash value as an asset. So if you have term insurance, it's not an issue in terms of asset qualification because there's no cash value. But whole life insurance, if there's cash value tied to that, they're going to look at that as an asset if the face value is over $1,500 total across all of your life insurance policies, not per policy. And then other than those, and you can also prepay your burial expenses for about $15,000 too. So you can have some of these things that they'll let you keep. The home, eventually they'll eat up the equity on, but other assets, you're not allowed to have more than $2,000 if as a single person. So you have to spend down to that point. And in terms of your income, all of your income has to go towards your cost of care, except for about $45 a month. So you're not really able to have any discretionary income on top of paying for your care. So single people on Medicaid in a long-term care facility are going to have very little remaining at that time in their own name if they're going to qualify. Married couples, it's different, depending on whether one spouse is at home or if they're both in the facility. But if one spouse is still living at home, what they call the community spouse, that spouse can keep the home, no lien placed on it. That spouse at home can keep all of their IRA, 403B, 401k, qualified retirement accounts, whether it's Roth or traditional, in their own name and not have to spend that down on their spouse's care. So, if they have all the retirement amount of money in their IRAs and the spouse in care has nothing, then all of their retirement accounts are protected because the spouse at home is the one that owns those accounts. Now, if the reverse of that's true, that's obviously money that will have to be spent on care. The same sort of exemptions are made for the vehicle, the life insurance amount for a married couple, that's the same whether you're married or single, and the burial expenses, you can pay about 15 grand per individual when you're doing that, and close family members as well, immediate family members. So potentially you could cover a lot of insurance cost or burial insurance cost with that. But then the other assets, the assets they deem countable assets, joint bank accounts, individual bank accounts, the spouse who's in care, their IRAs or 401k type assets, cash value of life insurance over that $1,500 face value amount, really anything else, other additional property, they add all the value of that up and say, okay, you can only keep so much of that. So if a couple had about $200,000 in countable assets, not including the exempt assets I mentioned earlier, they'll say, we're going to divide that in half. And if that half falls below $50,000, that spouse at home still gets to keep at least $50,000 of the countable assets. They can't go below that. They can't force them below that. And then the max that they get to keep of the countable assets is roughly between 137 and 138,000. So if somebody had $500,000 in countable assets, they're not keeping $250,000. They're still maximum keeping about $137,000. So that's what that married couple then has to spend down to of the countable assets before Medicaid will provide assistance. In terms of income, the spouse at home gets to keep all of their income. They don't have to spend their income coming in their name on the spouse's care. And if they're below about $2,800 a month at the current levels, then they can keep enough of the spouse who's in care, enough of their income shifts over to the spouse at home to get them up to that amount. So depending on the income levels, that could potentially be all of the income staying with the spouse at home if they're, total between the two of them under about $2,800 a month. So obviously that's a lot of spend down for some people. Spending down as quickly as possible is sometimes the goal that people come in with, and whether or not that's the best idea is I guess a matter of interpretation. I would say it's not the best idea to just spend down as quickly as you can and try to get qualified as soon as you can, because that can really limit your future options for care. And before I talk about those, just a quick overview of the VA improved pension I mentioned. In order to qualify for this, it's a direct pension payment to the veteran or the surviving spouse of the wartime veteran. They have to be a wartime veteran according to the VA's dates on wartime periods. So that's pretty easy to look up if you typed in like VA wartime dates to get a sense of if you fall within the ranges. Some people right now, especially the current generation, falls a lot of times between Korea and Vietnam, and so they don't qualify for the wartime periods. You don't have to have been in a theater of combat. As long as you were active duty during that period of time, doesn't matter where you were stationed. And then as long as you were not dishonorably discharged and served for at least 90 days of active duty, so not including like basic training and things like that, then you might qualify for this as a service qualification. But in order to income-wise and asset-wise qualify, if your income is higher than the maximum amount of the pension benefit, you won't get that pension benefit at all. So for a married wartime veteran, they can get about $2,400 a month from this pension potentially. But if their income between them and their spouse was, $1,000 a month, they might get $1,400 a month from the VA to get them up to that level. But if they were at $5,000 a month, they're not getting anything from the VA. However, for care, they deduct the care costs from that veteran's income. So this can be a really good tool to help stretch out your assets further, because you're getting closer potentially to actually being able to privately pay. So if someone's care costs are $5,000 a month, or to make my math easier, they're $5,400 a month, and between both them and their spouse, they have $3,000 a month. Well, they could get the full wartime pension benefit for that veteran and potentially privately pay indefinitely for some people, or a lot longer than other people would. So that can really stretch out the assets for a lot of people. It might be the difference between being able to privately pay for 3 years to privately paying for 5 or 10, or as long as you need to. It's not always going to be the case, because it really does depend on the cost of care and your other income levels, but it's helpful when it does stretch that out. In terms of assets for the VA, they never count the home as an asset, and as long as you don't have more than 2 acres of land, they don't count the land as an asset. If you go beyond the 2 acres, they count any additional acreage as land or as an asset that will count towards your total. Just like Medicaid, they have a cap on total assets you can have that are countable, and they don't differ if you're married or single for the VA. That's a maximum of about 138,000. So they're similar to Medicaid on that. And there's no other exemptions for like IRAs or 401ks of the healthy spouse. That doesn't matter for the VA. So these are both programs we look at using for people to help stretch out their assets a lot longer. Medicaid, obviously, you have to spend down quite a bit to get there. But a lot of people look at ways of, do I just do that spend down, or do I try to protect these assets in some way so that I have something there that can supplement things or can be used for other things that I won't be able to otherwise afford once I'm on Medicaid, right? And this is where we get a lot of questions, and you'll see on that handout of, should I put the home in the kid's name? Should I gift the home to the kids? Is this a good idea? And generally speaking, it doesn't tend to be a good idea. Now, there's always exceptions for, there's no absolute statements, right, that would apply for every situation. But most of the time, there's more risks than benefits to putting the home in the kid's name. So a lot of times when we're talking about stretching assets for care or protecting assets from care, we're looking at maintaining as much control as possible over decisions, over over the assets themselves, over the right to use those assets. And the number one way to give up control over an asset is to actually have somebody else own it with no other sorts of agreements in place. So that's the concern of, well, my son could evict me or charge me rent or sell the property without my permission, right? And legally speaking, they could. Morally speaking, it's horrible to do that to your parent, but legally speaking, they could. And so that's a big risk if you're transferring that asset over to somebody else to own. Now, hopefully your kids would not do that to you, but it's a risk, right? It's a concern. It's also not good tax planning to transfer real estate over to the kids while you're still living. And the reason for that is the IRS basically says, all right, whatever you paid for your home or put into the home value-wise, and this is a huge simplification, so it's more complicated than this, but generally speaking, whatever you paid for your home, that's your cost basis. And then when you sell your home, the difference between that cost basis and what you sold it for, that's your capital gain that you might have to pay tax on. Well, you as the primary, when you sell your primary residence, as long as you've lived there for 2 of the last 5 years, you can get a $250,000 capital gains exclusion from having to pay any tax on that gain. So if you're married, that's $500,000, right? So most of us, when we sell our homes, don't have a big enough gain where we have to worry about that. However, when you don't live in a property, when it's not your primary residence, like a vacation property or rental property that you own, if you sell it and there's a gain, you don't get that exclusion because it's not your primary residence. So when you transfer it over to the kids, when you gift it to them and you don't sell it to them for fair market value, that's when the IRS is going to say, well, whatever you paid for it, we're going to say they paid for it in terms of their cost basis. Well, when they sell it later on, after you pass away or when you need to go into care, they're going to have a capital gains tax paid on the gain. Now, this could be avoided if they were left that property through your estate plan when you pass away. So when you pass away and a property like that transfers to the kids or whomever, that's when that cost basis that you had actually gets adjusted up to fair market value at the date of your death or near the date of your death in terms of value. So what that means essentially is if the kids sell it after they've inherited it, then they're going to have little to no capital gains tax to pay. So, but when you've transferred it ahead of time, that step up in basis doesn't happen when you die because you don't own the property anymore. It's not part of your estate. So it's something to be aware of if you're trying to do proper tax planning and better tax planning. You don't want to just protect the assets for the next generation just to have them pay about 15 to 20%, depending on their tax brackets, in capital gains tax, right? It's sort of like gifting money to the IRS, and not too many people want to do that anyway. Another really big concern with putting the home in the kid's name directly is that anything that happens to the owner of a property also happens to that property. So what I mean by that is what happens if the kids get sued or if they get divorced, file for bankruptcy, they pass away before you. What happens to that property? Well, if they file for bankruptcy and their creditors see, well, you have this secondary property ownership in that, we're going to attach a lien on that, or we're going to, force you to sell it, right? What happens if they get sued? Same sort of thing. It's an asset of theirs. If they get divorced, it's an asset that could potentially be divided on divorce. Now, that would maybe be a different situation because a lot of divorce, allocations are negotiated. So I'm sure that would be a little different, but it's potentially it's something that could happen. The bigger concern that we have to, even on top of all of those things, is what happens if one of those children passes away before their parent? Well, then their ownership in that home goes according to their estate plan. If their will says it goes to my spouse, well, then now you have an in-law owning your property. Is that what you would want? What happens if it goes down to a child of that, a grandchild of yours, or your child if you're the child that they've gifted it to? What happens if that child has a substance abuse problem at the time, or if they have, they're not very responsible, or they're really young adults where they're not, they just don't have the experience to manage these things? What happens to that at that time when it needs to be sold? A real life example that came into our office one time is the family had gifted the home to the 4 kids, and 2 of the 4 kids passed away before mom and dad did. And one of the 4 kids that passed was a single parent, and their grandson, when it came time to sell the home, was about 25. He owned a quarter of the home. Well, he had a substance abuse problem. He had addiction issues, and the family wanted to stop him from not benefiting from the money, but from having direct control over the proceeds of the sale, because their concern was that, well, he's going to use this to fuel his addiction, right? And they were just looking for ways to protect him. And unfortunately, there's really nothing that they could do to stop him from having access to those funds, because he owned a quarter of the home. He was entitled to the quarter of the proceeds. And unless he willingly gave that up to someone else, they were not going to be able to have the control taken from him on that. And so the concern is that that could happen, right? You hope it never happens. It might not be anticipated that it happens, but if you don't have any planning in place to deal with those sort of unforeseen issues, what happens if these things happen concern, you're leaving out a lot of protection that could otherwise be placed on that property for the next generation. So how do we plan on planning around these properties instead, or any assets that someone's trying to protect for care? Well, that's when we look generally more at irrevocable trusts to do that. So you still transfer assets to those trusts. Any sort of transfers like this that you have to do, you want to do ideally more than 5 years before you'd need to go into care, because then you're looking at not having to. The Medicaid has a look back period of 5 years where they say, show us what you did 5 years before the application. So you still want to try to do this planning around those 5 years. But once it's in the irrevocable trust, if the kids are the trustees, well, one, you're always granted the right to reside in the property as long as you pay property taxes and utility bills and all of the expenses. So the trustees of that trust can't evict you, charge you rent, sell the property without your permission. So there's one concern taken care of. It's also part of your estate when you pass away. So that means that it gets adjusted to fair market value cost basis wise, so that the kids don't have to pay a disproportionate amount of capital gains on it. The biggest protection though for that irrevocable trust is that anybody who's inheriting from you, if they have any of the concerns I mentioned, like a substance abuse problem or just irresponsible, there's triggers in there that say, well, our trustee can decide that person's not allowed to have access to those funds. It's still there for their benefit, but they're not in charge of it. And also during your lifetime, the trustee's liabilities personally do not apply to the trust. If I was somebody's trustee and I was getting sued, that trust is not an asset of mine. I'm just managing it for them, right? So that's not a concern when they're just a trustee of that trust as opposed to an actual owner of the property. How do you use these trusts to stretch out assets though? Is it just about protecting things, or is it about stretching it as long as you can too? The way our firm and myself personally, we tend to look at these trusts is not that this money will never have to be spent on care. That's not necessarily the goal. But oftentimes when somebody spends down to the Medicaid qualification levels, they have nothing additional that they can use to supplement their care. Things that Medicaid might not be covering, like, is it the private room or is it a shared room? Do you want a roommate when you're 90, right? Does the facility include cable bills and their costs, or would you have to pay additional for that? Do you like to go out to eat once a month or once a week? I mean, what types of things bring good quality of life for that individual? And can that be something that they can actually cover when they're only allowed $45 a month in income, right? And only have $2,000 in assets. Most of the time, that's not very helpful to them to help cover those costs. So the whole purpose of setting aside money in something like an irrevocable trust is that there's ways for the people you trust to be able to receive funds from it to supplement those expenses, to stretch it out a lot longer. Because remember, once you're on Medicaid, Medicaid's paying most of that bill, but maybe you want the private room still, and the kids agree with the facility, all right, we're gonna help pay an additional $500 a month so that mom or dad gets the private room and maybe the room with the view, right? Whatever it is. And that's what that money can be used for. So one of the things with the irrevocable trust that I tell people is, it doesn't matter if the money's all spent by the time that person passes, as long as they got the quality of care and the quality of life that they wanted out of that care for as long as they possibly could. Now, if somebody's really just trying to protect an asset and not spend it at all, maybe a family cottage or something like that, they could do that too, but the choice is there for them to decide whether that's what they want to do or not. A really big use that can be really unforeseen for a lot of people is a lot of these facilities require a couple years of private payment before somebody gets on Medicaid and they allow them to stay in that facility. They may not accept Medicaid at all, or they may not accept Medicaid right away. So if you can meet that private payment, you have a lot of choice in where you're able to live in terms of care. But what happens if you've privately paid for one facility, you are down to Medicaid level, so you've met that one facility's private payment, but then you have to go to a different facility because of care needs changing or because that facility went out of business, which has happened. What do you do in those situations? What if the new facility is requiring private payment as well? And that's where setting aside money, protecting this money in something like an irrevocable trust can really provide the option for you to privately pay again so that you have a choice in where you go and you're not stuck with limited options. So these irrevocable trusts are not just about setting things aside so that they never have to be spent, but they're about protecting things so that you can qualify for Medicaid and still have money left over to potentially stretch it out further and pay for the good quality of life that you want and deserve as long as you can. And it's really about maintaining control over choice more than anything else. With that, I'm out of time here. I see a little overtime actually, so I will let everybody go. But just a reminder that next week our topic is on specifically end of life directives. So things like your living will, or things like who gets to make decisions over burial things like are you cremated or just buried naturally, right? What's the who makes those decisions and what types of documents do they need to make those decisions? And what are the considerations you want to have when we're talking about those types of documents, whether it's your faith or just healthcare decisions, things like that you would want made for you. And that's the same time next week on Wednesday. So if that's of interest to you, please feel free to sign up for that as well. I don't see any questions, and I've talked longer than I'm supposed to, so I will let everybody go and enjoy the rest of your day. But thank you all for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.